the video. In this track, we talked about women in leadership, and we're joined by Wiley, who coaches women in their early leadership careers so more women can reach the C-suite. We talked about questions such as, what are the advantages to being a woman in leadership, and how will the role of women in leadership change over time? And this was an absolutely amazing conversation, and I can't wait for you to hear it. So without further ado, enjoy the track. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Trek. The Trek is a Civics Unplugged series where community members participate in meaningful discussions on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about building the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we venture together into complex but important conversations related to building the future and democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. My name is Madison. I'm a high school senior from Verdigris, Oklahoma, joined by some of our community members and a special guest, which you will hear from in just a moment. So we start off with a word association, and tonight we're talking about women in leadership. So when you see your name on the screen, say the 1 to 3 words that you associate with the topic, introduce yourself, and go for it, Maryam.
Hello, my name is Maryam. I'm from the suburbs of Chicago. I'm 17, and my 3 words are powerful and not enough.
I can go. My name is Leora. I'm a high school senior from the Boston area. I guess the first words that came to my mind were girl boss. And I just can't control that. So those were the first words that came to my mind.
Hi, my name is Elena. I am 17. I am a high school junior, currently living in the Broward County area of Florida. And the word that I associated with women in leadership is essential.
Hi, my name is Phoebe Chambers. I'm 18 years old. I'm a high school senior from the Washington, D.C. area. And the 3 words that I associated with the topic of women in leadership are we need more.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm from Northern Virginia and I'm 15 years old. And the 2 words that I thought of were strong and diverse.
I'm Lillian. I'm 15 and I'm a high school sophomore from the Minneapolis, Minnesota area. And I decided the word was necessary.
Hi, I'm Lisa, and I'm from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I live this stuff all the time. I'm a coach who supports women early in their leadership careers. And my words, I would say, you're all speaking my language, essential and fraught, unfortunately.
Hey, so my words are democracy's doing better. So I'm just looking at New Zealand, Germany, Taiwan, etc. Women heads of state. There's no coincidence there.
Yeah, and I would just say different standards, obviously. But I mean that men in leadership. So an example, something I really admire about Gary is how blunt he is, and that just brings so much value to conversations to have someone who's a voice of reason and able to talk about what's actually going on. But I feel like there's different standards. If I were to be blunt, I feel like it would be taken differently, and that's just seen in so many different leadership characteristics as well. So I think that's something that's really interesting to explore and try to balance with women in leadership. But yeah, thank you all for taking part in that. Now we can go into the actual conversation. So does anyone have a question or provocation they want to pose?
Well, Madison, just based on something that you said, I would love to kind of this is, I guess, more of a provocation, but talk about different standards and how that plays out, and I guess how people respond to it. And my contribution, I guess, to kick it off is how people text or email or communicate. I feel like women like that I know of, and that like myself feel the need to like put I think that maybe, or like smiley faces, or like things like that, because it's like I don't want to come off as rude and I just want to be like as nice as I can be. And then like whenever I'll get a response from like someone that's a man, then it'll be like thanks period, and I'm like, oh no, like I would never do that. But it's like I have like found myself consciously trying to like not feel the need to like make myself sound as nice as I can be all the time. But it's just something that I've noticed that like happens a lot, and that's just like one situation and like different standards, but I love to hear everyone else's thoughts too.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because now it's something touching with linguistics and you're letting me nerd out. So thank you for that. It's actually a thing that like women feel the need to like placate more in their emails. Like they'll use a lot more exclamation points or like things to make it more casual and things like that. And anyways, that's a totally separate thing, but that's just what my mind jumped to. But no, that's like a very real phenomenon as far as I've learned about it.
Do you have thoughts about why that is?
I think it just goes to like traditional gender roles and women feeling the need to like kind of be like feel the need that in order to, you know, rise in the ranks, they need to be extra nice to everybody. They need to be in a kind of subordinate role. Or because if you're too strong, if you're too aggressive, then you would be like a bitch. Sorry, excuse my language.
We had a really interesting experience in Ontario really recently, because one of our members of parliament was trying to hold our premier accountable for his handling of the pandemic and what he's been doing. And she was giving she was being very professional, giving very clear points. And he said to her, your voice is like nails on a chalkboard. And that's the trouble, right? It's the reason that so often we put in all those nice smiley faces and everything is because we're constantly told that we're too harsh, or we're too this, or we're too that.
Yeah, I constantly feel like if I have to give somebody a talking to, I have to be very, very careful and just keep my voice at a certain just like timbre, so I don't sound like I'm yelling, or like my voice will always like jump like 2 octaves up if I'm, yelling. People will be like, oh, you're being shrill, and no one likes a shrill, nagging woman. And especially with like emotions and showing emotion, I feel like there's very much a double standard, because if you do show emotion, then it's like, oh, you're weak, you're vulnerable. Women are just too emotional to make decisions. But then if we don't show emotion, it's like, oh, you're cold, like you're heartless. Like I think like something that I've noticed, so especially like thinking back to the 2016 American presidential election, is people would get really mad that Hillary Clinton would just not cry. And she said, like, I'm not like a baking cookies kind of mom, to paraphrase. And then people got mad at her for that. But then I was just kind of like, but she wasn't, like, she was conditioned to be able to not show emotion when she was working in a field of mostly like men, because they would see her as weak. So it just feels like sometimes we just cannot win when it comes to standards like that.
So, oh, what were you going to say, Lisa?
I was just going to say, it feels like that razor's edge. You go a little too much one way, a little too much the other way is wrong, and you're on this razor's edge.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's just hard to win either way. And I want to pose a question now that we've talked about, like some of the disadvantages. Like, what are the advantages of like being a woman in a leadership position? Like, and that's from like over like if you were to like for men in leadership. Does that make sense?
I mean, I don't know that this is necessarily attributed as much to me being a woman as it is just to my personality. But I run like a website with my best friend who's a male. And we have a staff of like 25 kids. And the majority of them prefer to reach out to me than to him when it comes to like asking for an extension on a project or things like that. And I think that maybe the fact that I am a woman, I don't know, makes me more approachable in that way. But once again, I don't really know if that's something that can be attributed necessarily to like femininity, or if it's attributed to my personality, or if it's a mix of both. I think that they fear my wrath less than his, and therefore they're more open to have that line of communication.
Yeah, one of my favorite life quotes is ask not what you can do for misogyny, ask what misogyny can do for you. And I think sometimes like there are in crowded spaces or in competitive fields where you want to stand out, and sometimes your gender does make you stand out. Like obviously, Model United Nations is not leadership on, the macro level, but on a micro level, like if I'm in a committee and I'm one of 3 girls in there, the chair is probably going to want to call on me more and pay attention so they don't get called sexist. And is that sad? Yeah, but that's the truth.
For sure. I completely relate on that. And even in like classroom spaces where like a lot of the times like in like high level like math or science classes, I feel like my teachers are like when I don't understand something, I'm like, hey, like I really wasn't getting this. They'll be like, oh, like let me sit down or like talk to you or like help you because it's clear that like of course you wouldn't understand this. Like you're a girl. It's like, there's something going on here that definitely shouldn't be going on here, which is like I don't know, that's something that I just wanted to bring up in relation to Phoebe's point. But besides that, I think that like there are a lot of advantages that come with being a woman in leadership. And I look at countries like I think like New Zealand with like Jacinda Ardern, like things like that. Like the way that she runs her country is always so inspiring. And like especially I was just talking about this with someone else, like how she handled like COVID and things like that. I was like, sometimes I wish that I was there because like they were back to normal for so long. It's like that's so cool. Or like, I mean, even in like not politics, like directors, things like that for movies, like I don't know if you all are familiar with like the To All the Boys I've Loved Before, like movie series, but like the first one was like really good and everyone loved it and it was directed by a woman. And then the other two just like completely kind of tanked. And like I found out that those two were both directed by a man. I was like, that's really interesting that like how that kind of played out. And I think there's like a lot of advantages that come with being a woman, but it's like hard to break into like actually getting that leadership role in the first place, which is definitely a problem.
Yeah, I also
Sorry.
well, I was like, I definitely agree that there are like a lot of advantages that come with being a woman in leadership roles, but I also feel like it's kind of a double-edged sword because like some of these advantages like shouldn't exist in some ways, like being recognized because you're in the minority. Like why are women in the minority in the first place? Like it doesn't seem like a complete advantage sometimes because it's not entirely fair in the first place.
To jump off that point a little bit, like I feel like kind of going back to what Phoebe was saying about like when you're one of the only women in the room, people pay attention to you more. That can be a good and bad thing because then they might hold you like they notice that you're there and they're like aware of that, which is great if you're succeeding, but then also when you're succeeding you feel like you have to always live up to that really successful standard because you are the only woman in that space and you need to represent women in that space as best as you can. But then on the other side of the spectrum, let's say you're the only woman in the space and you're not doing so well, then once again you're sort of like projecting onto your entire gender, and I feel like that's a standard that we get a lot, is like we feel the need to carry the burden of of all women, even though it's not what we need to do at all.
And Lillian, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I was just going back to Maryam's initial point and a point that Phoebe brought up. As women, we tend to be underestimated, which at times makes it really easy for us to play into those stereotypes and then end up exceeding expectations. So I think it's a double-edged sword, like Sam said, but it's definitely something that we can use to our advantage.
I think this is a really interesting question because, and like what you've all been saying is so interesting because like, at least for me, when I think of myself in like leadership situations or places where I'm expected to be leader, like I don't think a lot about like me being a woman. Or if I do, it's just one quality of a number of other things that I'm thinking about in that space of like, how can I be a good leader? but pointing out all these ways in which specifically being a woman could be an advantage in a leadership position is something I haven't thought very deeply about before, because it's like just one small thing among another, like a bunch of other things that I am thinking about.
So I'm curious about something, because we're talking about sort of the advantages to a woman being in leadership. And, you know, I'm wondering if there's an interest in kind of talking about societally, what is the benefit of having women in leadership? I mean, certainly what's happening in New Zealand and that sort of thing is a great evidence of that. But also, I mean, when we think about it, like right now, still the vast majority of leaders in the world are men. And they're making decisions and impacting the lives of 50% of the population that are not men. And, you know, there's a huge impact to that. And so the more women that we have in leadership, the greater the autonomy of women and that sort of thing as well. But I think that pressure of having to represent all women makes going into leadership so daunting. A man fails in leadership, and it's a person failing in leadership. It's not representing an entire part of the population.
I think like one of the major benefits is just like qualities that are more common in women. So like my mind instantly goes to empathy, and I think about like how women have responded to the pandemic, and I think that like a lot of those qualities have direct correlations with what they've been able to do. And so I think that like especially in certain times, like different times call for different leaders. I feel like the pandemic showed us that, right? So like again, like, you know, with we can just see like different countries around the world and how that has been helpful. But I would just say like things like empathy can really help societies, especially in times of crisis.
I also feel like with any population that isn't represented, you're gonna have like misunderstanding, and like that will like translate into like access to things. Like, you know, the pink tax is like a really big thing that it's like, why is that even a thing? But there's like not a lot of like women who can kind of like counteract that, just because they don't have the opportunity to in those positions of power. And I feel like if there was like a woman leading the country, they would have understanding of like just a lot of issues that like only affect women, and it's kind of like frustrating when there's like men making decision for like women that they'd never have to go through any of the things that they're making decisions for, because like they don't, I feel like they wouldn't understand the gravity of like certain situations, and they're still making decisions for it. And I feel like just in general, when someone is like making decisions for someone else and like that group doesn't have a seat at the table, it just can get really messy and like not very like appropriate and like accurate to what needs to be done. So I think that is definitely something that's like good to have women in leadership for like society in general. That was kind of like really roundabout, but I hope you understood what I was saying.
I know like Phoebe put this in the chat, but representation is just so important, not only for like on issues, but just so like future generations can see like, hey, a woman led our country. Like, that's so cool. Maybe I can lead a country. And just like, I don't know, having females in leadership, and like that's just really empowering to know like, oh, I can do that too. And at least that's a big benefit I see, is just kind of like inspiring the next generation.
There's something too I was thinking about when Maryam was speaking, and just how, you know, like we think of certain traits as being more feminine, like empathy and that sort of thing. The wonderful part is that when we start to get more women into leadership, that we can start to see leadership behaviors that are not, you know, in one category or the other, because it actually allows for like Hillary Clinton is not somebody that you would say empathy is the first thing that comes to mind, but it doesn't have to be, right? She doesn't have to be a warm, fuzzy leader in order to be a good leader. Sorry, Gary?
I'm just saying, wow, that's such a great point. There's so many different kinds of women leaders that They don't have to be, it doesn't have to be monolithic.
Right, right. And the other part, though, is it allows men to step into being empathetic leaders and that sort of thing, right? It starts to just allow for that natural variability to kind of take hold, instead of, you know, plugging people, like, we need an empathetic leader, so we better get a woman in here. We need a powerful leader, so we better get a man in here. You know, that kind of thing is keeping everybody into these boxes.
Lisa, that's such a great point. Something that I've been thinking about as well is, like, when we think about women in leadership, we think about someone who is just like very bold and, quite frankly, like embodies a lot of masculine characteristics to get there. Like, when I think of like powerful women in leadership, I think of like AOC, like Stacey Abrams, and like people who are like not even really able to fully tap into their femininity because of the standards of leadership. So, like, what I'm really excited to see over the next couple of decades is what you're talking about, like a new wave of feminine leadership where females can be in leadership positions, but also like champion their femininity. And so a question that I want to pose is, like, how do you think the role of women in leadership will change over time?
I will say, I do think the pandemic has put women in leadership as a setback, with a lot of families, you know, needing, with them kids having to be at home for school and families needing kids, you know, someone to take home and take care of them. And if both parents are working, chances are, from a statistical standpoint, if it's, you know, a traditional family unit, you know, two heterosexual parents, a man and a woman, because of, you know, the wage gap, there's probably the woman is probably going to have to be the one who has to stay home and take care of the kids. And especially when you still see disparities in, you know, maternity leave. But I mean, I'm an advocate for not just having maternity leave, but also having paternity leave, or really for anyone who's a parent, because it shouldn't just be that we have the one the stay-at-home parent necessarily doesn't have to be the mother. And yeah, I mean, the business of keeping women down and just keeping them in the home is just so, like, I mean, it's awful, but it's just a really fascinating concept to me. Like, I read The Feminine Mystique over the summer, and while that book definitely does, you know, a good job of explaining it, definitely leaves some groups of women out, like women of color and, you know, women who identify on the LGBT spectrum. But all of these, from, you know, cleaning companies to like journalism to like all of these businesses and power players in society, they all work together to continually suppress women for both economic and social benefits. So I don't know, I think that we really have to deal with that and just sort of deal with the pandemic before we really start to see, you know, this new wave of women in leadership.
Yeah, I feel like almost in an ideal world, like, we wouldn't have to even talk about it. Like, all those qualities that are traditionally feminine, like empathy and, you know, patience and things like that, are just leaders, qualities that all leaders are expected to have, no matter their gender. And that isn't to say, like, I want to, like, the experience of women should never be thought about again, just that it's not like such a big deal that we have to have discussions like this. But that's, like, you know, ideal, like everything's equal and yada yada yada. And obviously that's not, unfortunately, a reality that is so easily realized.
It's nice to think about, though, isn't it? I was doing a workshop, and one of the women said, like, I had a male colleague who said, are we still talking about that? Why are we still talking about gender at work? And it's like, because it's still a problem, like, you know, but I think so many women are even holding themselves back because they see how much of a struggle that women have in leadership, and how the way that they're treated in the media, and those like Hillary Clinton, or, you know, and so many others that have been so mistreated, that it is scary it's kind of scary to think about going into leadership and having to represent your entire gender and, you know, all of those kinds of things. That's a hell of a lot of pressure that a lot of people go, yeah, no, thank you.
And as far as like women in leadership roles, like if you compare more like liberal arts to like STEM, there's definitely more women in leadership roles that are like in liberal arts than STEM. And I find that really interesting because like if you're looking at like Europe especially, science and math were like considered for a time more feminine subjects than like the arts, which now it's more flipped. So hopefully it won't flip again, but hopefully it'll balance out where it's normal for women to be in STEM and in the liberal arts, and same with men in both ways.
Yeah, and another one that I just realized is like looks in general. Like I know, so if we're talking about politics, I know like everyone has to face that. Like obviously the past presidents, like if you're taller, like you're more likely to be elected, but like there's such like a disproportionate emphasis on how females look in leadership. Like pardon my bluntness here, but like most Congress people are like crusty old white men and they don't say anything about it, but like people make comments about like how Hillary looked or like what Nancy Pelosi is wearing today or whatever. And it's just like, that's so absurd to me that it's even a factor in that. It's just like how often it's brought up and just like how it's used as like a tool to bring women down, and how it's like, it's so discouraging to think that like I have to live up to these beauty standards if I want to be like a leader. It's just like, it's so absurd to me.
Oh, for sure. And like not even just like outward appearance, but like even inward qualities that they're like a lot of women I feel like are discouraged from like going into positions of leadership because they're like, oh, I'm soft spoken, so like I won't be able to command respect, or like I'm this or I'm that. And it's like women shouldn't be expected to like have to do something, because I don't know of any men who are like, I'm not fit to do this, or like I feel like it just comes naturally, like that entitlement to be like, oh yeah, like I belong here, versus like women who go through like all of these like, oh, I have to be this in order to like deserve respect, whereas like no, like you should just like automatically have that just like everyone else does. But I feel like not a lot in society is telling them that they do, just because of the way that like people react to something when it's a man versus a woman. I don't know, I said it like that, but I think it's just such a like, it's so frustrating to me to see all the time where it's like, oh, this person like got a nose job, or like this person, it's like that doesn't have anything to do with their job like at all. And like how is that anybody's business? But it becomes like news stories where it's like, I don't know, it's just like frustrating that people put such an emphasis on that, and like, you know, that they wouldn't do the same thing for men, where it's like we should be past that at this point, but I guess we really aren't.
I also feel like women in leadership positions and women in professional environments in general, like we're often forced into like one of two kind of categories based on the gender binary. We either want to be really empathetic and nurturing and conform to what's like traditionally feminine, or we want to make ourselves as much like men as possible because that's what's been traditionally perceived as professional, like that masculinity aspect. So there's no room for, you know, empathy and professionalism to coexist. There's no room for, you know, being nurturing and listening to people and being treated with respect to coexist. So it's impossible to be a person, and like more importantly to be a woman in the workplace without failing on one of those aspects. And I think that's disgusting, obviously.
And you know what's interesting, Lillian, is that if you took 1,000 people who identify as male and 1,000 people who identify as women, there would actually be more variability, like more variation of traits within each of those categories, or there's more variation within those categories than there is between them. So it's like a real artificial categorization when we're talking about traits, and we're not talking about, you know, all that, the complexities of, you know, defining gender. It's like it is really it's an artificial categorization when we talk about personality traits and things like that. So much of it is socialization, not something that's inherent in a person.
To go off of Lillian's point, like also I hate that there's no coexistence between emotion and leadership, because when women, or anyone, honestly, anyone in leadership shows emotion, they're seen as weak. But I think that like showing your emotions is so strong and it's very brave, because it's hard to be vulnerable, especially when you are in leadership, because you're putting yourself out there for a lot of people to see. And I think that especially women, because we're assumed to be overly emotional, that when we are emotional, we're kind of like shoved down into this like weak woman character, like that is just forced on us because of stereotypes. But I think that women and just leaders in general showing emotion is very powerful, and I hope to see in the future that more leaders have that vulnerability.
Yeah, I also wanted to add on to Lillian's point. I was watching a TV show the other day and I was like loving this woman character, and I was trying to think about why. And I think it was because like she's like strong and she's very powerful, but so often those characters are also written to be cold and unlikable. But she was like cool and funny while also being strong. And I was like, oh, that is so great. I'm so happy this character exists, because it's so rare for like a badass woman to not be completely cold. And I was like so happy to see that.
It's honestly the little things sometimes. Today I was watching a video for science class and they said women and men in like a certain field. I was like, that's very rare that they put women first. And like I had to like pause the video and take a second. I was like, wait, that makes me so happy.
There is change happening, you know. I mean, and unfortunately, yeah, the pandemic has really impacted numbers and targets and that sort of thing. Societally, there's still a long way to go, but you know, I think about when I watch movies with my kids, and there's like, you know, we can almost pick the year before which the movie was made or after which, because somewhere around 2015, women in movies started to just have more dimensions and be a little bit more human, rather than these two-dimensional caricatures of women. You know, it's very interesting. So there's something shifting, not fast enough, but something.
Anyone have something to add, or a question or provocation they want to pose?
I have one, I just can't word it. Words.
Go for it. I can try and help you. I can try and translate it.
I don't know. I've just really, between what everyone's saying about like coexistence between certain like traits, and what we were talking about, like change happening, especially when it comes in the media and how people and how women are portrayed, both like in movies and also like on the news and like things like that. I was just trying to think like what do you think was a defining moment for women in leadership, or just like, I don't know. When I think of like this image of a woman in like the public eye, be it in leadership or like in entertainment or something like that, showing, you know, bravery and all of the qualities I admire in a woman in the public eye, I think of like the Me Too movement and like all of the women and men who like came out and they were vulnerable, which kind of goes back to my point of like emotion, and why I think that's so brave. But I think that was a huge turning point for women in leadership, and just how women are portrayed. Like it started like this cultural revolution on how we see women, especially in leadership positions and in the workplace.
I think so much of the concept of women in leadership is just born out of resistance. Like if you look at a lot of, you know, the anger that people felt in the 2016 election, you look at the 20, and at least like in the United States, you look at the 2018 midterms and you see record numbers of women running for office and getting elected to office. And a lot of people got really mad when the president at the time said, oh, this is all because of me. And in a way, I think it was, I don't want to say that like he didn't do anything to help, but he did, in a lot of ways wake a lot of people up to, the misogyny and like what's acceptable for people to say. But also like, I think that people are just starting to see women in a different way. Like, especially if you look at like the whole concept of suburban women and suburban women coming together. Like I listened to this podcast episode from the New York Times about, women's and places like Ohio organizing for Joe Biden because of they didn't like the character that they were seeing. Like I find that like when I see a lot of, like suburban women talk about why they don't like a certain political candidate, it's never about like specific policies, it's about character. And I'm just like, well, as women, like we should care about policy, but also we shouldn't discount character. So I would say in terms of a one single solidifying moment, it's probably just like the 2016 election and the immediate aftermath.
I'm trying to think about like in my own life when I like who I looked up to or when I felt like, wow, like I want to be like this person. And like it's so cliche, but I just always think about my mom because like she is in like a very male dominated field and she is never like it's just like whatever for her. And she is just like never felt like to like I'm sure she's like felt like she needs to like quiet her voice down sometimes. She doesn't care. And so I think that I don't know in popular culture what that defining moment is, but I know like for me it's always been my mom.
All right, if no one has any other questions or responses to add, we can go ahead and hop into reflection. So I'm going to send a link to the notes in the chat so that you all can look at them. And I can get us started, but when you all have yours ready, go ahead and shout it out. I guess that this conversation has helped me realize that it's not just about having representation of women in leadership, it's like having good representation. I mean, just for the sake of like, I guess it's kind of sad that like women in leadership represent their whole gender, but like to shift, I guess like the Overton window, like we need like really, really good examples that lead the way and give other women the courage to step into leadership positions and honestly just like change the expectations and the standards for other women in the future. And we don't have to go in order. If you want to go ahead and say your reflection, go for it.
Well, I'll just say that one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, especially as like an application into my own life, is that I don't really necessarily have to conform to like what a woman leader should be in like the spaces that I enter, because like that's not my responsibility to like cater to people's expectations. And I feel like a lot of the times I definitely feel like I should, and so I like act a certain way just because I feel like that's like what's expected. But I'm definitely gonna make like a conscious effort to just like not get in my head about like all those expectations and really just try and be like authentically me regardless of like what people are thinking about like how I should act. So I appreciate that for like conclusion that we kind of have come to in this conversation as well.
Yeah, to go back to what we were saying before, I think for me, something that is really making me think is like using my womanhood or me being a woman to my advantage. I had like just that thought had never graced my mind before. Not that I felt the need to like push those parts of me aside, but I never thought about bringing them into the forefront or using those parts of me to my advantage. So I definitely am thinking about that.
I think it's so powerful to just think about bringing your whole self to your leadership. And, you know, there's certain aspects of what's traditionally feminine being unacceptable, like emotion in leadership. Well, by God, there should be emotion in leadership. It's important. And so many of the things that we sort of, as women, sometimes sort of try to minimize or set aside can be extraordinarily powerful in leadership. Something that I often do with my clients is sort of talk about little experiments, because we internalize so many of the messages that society gives us about what's okay, what's not okay. And sometimes we're doing that and actually keeping ourselves inside a box. And it can be really exciting to just start to, you know, try stepping forward a little bit more, see if just speaking your mind actually does get the whole room to be aghast and horrified with you, or if it actually works okay, you know, those kinds of things. Because being your authentic self is what's going to really help you to step into that leadership and continue to have things moving forward.
I mean, Elisa, what you said just there, I'm about to write it down, but I just wanted to comment on it. Like, running those like experiments is so important, because like, I don't know, I think a lot of times we like, maybe those standards exist, but maybe sometimes we're just like, we think that they exist, or like certain expectations, and we're just like not testing the waters. And I think that like those little like Elena said, like it's the small things, right? It's like the small things can like give other women like the courage to like, even we talk about written messages, you know, like if they see a woman in a position who's like writing a message and not using like a million exclamation marks, like that will like help them think that like that's not a standard that I have to follow. But yeah, that was a great point.
And kind of going off of that, like, I don't know, this like trek kind of just made me think about like a leadership toolkit almost, like how there's no set gender like parts of our personality that we have to use. Like, it don't have to be overly emotional, like you were talking about with like writing emails. And it's just like a really good reminder to, you know, like be the best leader you can be. And that means being a well-rounded one who can use emotion, but also like maybe strategy and bluntness if it like fits the situation.
Absolutely.
So when I think about women in leadership, I often refer or think about the construction or the composition of the U.S. State Department, and 72% of the State Department is male. And that's ridiculous to think that there are diplomats representing the U.S. who aren't really indicative of the country that they're representing. So I think so much of the information that was shared tonight was so profound, but it was also getting to the idea that how do we encourage men to allow women to enter these spaces? And this past summer, I had the opportunity to speak with Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield when she was still at Georgetown, and she said, if men do not allow you a space at the table, what resources do you need to tap into to build your own table? And I think that goes to Elena's or Sam's point, but also Elena's point throughout this conversation, where you have a toolbox and it's learning how to leverage those skills and the combination of those resources to create the space in which you are welcomed, but not just welcomed for women, but welcomed for everyone, because you want to champion an inclusive policy and an inclusive philosophy if you want your change to be sustainable in the future.
Sort of similar to what Sam said about a leadership toolkit, you know, I've just sort of been thinking about, you know, how most of like the two like archetypes of women leaders, and like in terms of like the spectrum of like things that are traditionally like masculine and feminine as a person, I'm probably like in the middle of people overall, but like on women, I'm definitely more on like the masculine side. And I think that like as I step into more leadership roles, I've just sort of tried to like hush the feminine parts of myself. And I've just been thinking that after this, I should try to, you know, embrace my femininity more as a tool of power rather than a weakness.
Can I add something here as well? I think that there's such an important piece here in involving men in these conversations, right? I think that most men are good guys who, you know, just don't see it and don't actually understand how unwelcoming a space can be, or how much of a razor's edge that women can be asked to walk. And when you actually talk to them and you kind of share your experiences and that kind of thing, they can be pretty interested and pretty open to hearing it. Because yeah, you've got you've got the men with so much of the power, and it's like until more women get into power, it's going to be really hard to take up that space. But involving men in becoming allies is such an important piece.
I guess I can go on reflections. I think my biggest takeaway from all of this is sort of like going back to the whole, I need to be able to embrace my femininity and, you know, the parts of me that are more stereotypically womanly, but also I need to be true to the parts of me that are, you know, societally seen as more masculine. I need to be more bold and outspoken because I am sort of that person, but I tend to hush that down in leadership positions because I don't think that that's the kind of image people want to see from me. So I think that I've been thinking this whole night about Madison wrote a fantastic piece on the platform about the next generation of women orators and how she hopes to see a rise of fiercely passionate and bold and outspoken women, like women orators. And I thought, I've just been thinking about that. I'm ready to embrace that side as well as my more feminine side. So yeah.
Lillian?
I mean, I guess the last thing I'd note, obviously being professional doesn't make you less of a woman. Being a woman doesn't make you less professional, as I mentioned earlier. And also going back to what Leora noted in the, you know, reflection thing, it is very funny to use patriarchy, like, to your advantage. Like, being really nice to your male competitors before a debate round or a mock trial round, and then absolutely, like, wiping the floor with them during it is so funny. It's extremely refreshing. So would 10 out of 10 recommend that. And yeah, no, this has been a really cool conversation. So thank you all for coming.
All right, Gary, you can go ahead and stop screen sharing. Lisa and Luna, since this was your first trek, would love to hear what you thought about the trek overall.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me all to this trek. It was exciting. I think this was the first trek that actually fit in the schedule. I thought it was really thought-provoking and really inspiring, and I think it's really refreshing to hear that these conversations are being explored with emerging and already, emerging leaders. So it's hopeful. It brings me hope. So thank you for sharing your thoughts.
I would agree, absolutely. It was amazing to hear from everybody, and I feel like I could just definitely, you know, tuck in for the next couple hours and continue the conversation. Yeah, I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming. I really enjoyed this conversation as well. I feel like we covered a lot in just a short amount of time. It was really eye-opening. Lisa and Luna, would obviously love to have you at a future track. So if you're down to have another one on another topic, just let us know. We do these pretty frequently. But for everyone else, thank you for coming, and I hope you all have a great rest of your night, and I will see you later. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.